Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Calvin Andrassi, and I am recording this video because I called out sick from work, and I wanted to go ahead and give a little bit of contextual information through a video on the United States Constitution for the second week of class. Um, and you can probably tell by my voice that it's not its usual tone and timbre. Um, but I hope you do appreciate the depth and the huskiness behind it. Um, Perhaps it'll make it a little bit more enjoyable for some of you. Okay, so this week we are examining the United States Constitution, and I wanted to give a little bit of background as to where the ideas for this all sort of came from, so that we can really come to understand what it is that the Constitution represents in American society and American government. Okay, so some of the things that we want to particularly take a look at, explain how evolving debates about liberty led from the Revolutionary War to the Constitutional Convention, discuss the major proposals in compromise over representation in the Constitutional Convention, in order to make everybody, uh, in order to kind of satisfy us about the way representation should work. The founding fathers came up with some interesting compromises that kind of allowed everyone to have some degree of power, regardless of their population and other characteristics like that. Summarize the key issues presented by Federalists and Anti-Federalists in ratification debates for the Constitution. Really fascinating series of articles. Um, the Federalist Papers, um, for example, are several dozen articles that were written at the time arguing in favor of a federalist government. They are widely available online for everybody to potentially access and read. And I do highly recommend, if you are interested in understanding the uh, context behind the system that was ultimately put together by the founding fathers, that you do take a look at a number of those Federalist Papers. Federalist Paper 10 and number 57 are two of the more popular ones, but reading through all of them, you'll really come to understand um, the ideas that were going through the founding fathers' heads as they were putting together what would ultimately be a constitutional republic. Then discuss continuing debates about democracy and the Constitution. Okay, so the first question I would like everyone to ask themselves, hopefully understanding the basic um, structure of the United States. And again, at present, we have 50 different states, which have their own power to be able to pass a significant amount of statutory and other types of legislation and programs and policies within their own state. But also above those 50 states is an overarching federal government, a central government that takes on certain roles as well. So now the question is, what should be more important, the individual rights of the states or individual liberties in this particular case? Um, and who should ultimately be the guarantor of, or the guarantor, I suppose would be the proper way of saying that, of individual liberties? Should it be the federal government? What should go in that regard? So, again, to sort of provide some of that initial context, you have to kind of understand what the individuals living in the colonies thought about government in general, right? So the driving experience of the initial 13 colonies in the United States was that, of course, they were primarily under the control of the British Empire prior to the establishment of the United States and the Declaration of Independence in 1776. That would be on July 4th, which is why we celebrate Independence Day on July 4th, 1776, here in the United States. But essentially, you had King George over in Great Britain that did not provide the colonists any type of political representation at Parliament, and at the same time, the monarchy was imposing a series of taxes, and price increases and restrictions on the individual liberties of the colonists living in those 13 original colonies. So, with the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence, the general notion was that men like King George would seek power because they're ambitious, greedy, and easily corruptible. So this is something that sort of echoes Aristotle about, very close to 2,000 years beforehand, where he argued that a single ruler that is greedy and is seeking to self-aggrandize leads to a form of government known as tyranny. Okay? So colonists believed that there were certain natural, inalienable rights, many of which who argued that stemmed from divine providence, that stemmed from a god, potentially a Christian god, or perhaps a more general deistic god, that basically, established these rights and liberties that cannot be taken away by anybody in the position of authority, that everybody ought to be guaranteed. Okay. Now, some of the philosophies and things that allowed the Declaration of Independence to be structured the way it did came from some of the early modern political thinkers at the time. The big three are the British Thomas Hobbes. We also have John Locke, who I believe was Scottish, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is French. And the long and the short of it is these three philosophers kind of laid the groundwork for asserting what we consider to be modern politics or modern government, that looked beyond simply the rulers and the policies that existed, but also brought in the idea of the citizenry as being central to the functioning of government. So with Thomas Hobbes, he wrote a seminal work known as the Leviathan. So the Leviathan is this biblical sea serpent monster that was believed to roam the deeps of the oceans. And it was sort of a message that if you get away from civilization, essentially, as a boat going onto the ocean, you no longer are under the protection of that civilization, and you can be sank by this horrible sea monster, which is existence outside of civilization, essentially. So it likened being outside of a civil society as a basic death sentence where you have no security and you are at the whim and the mercy of external forces, again, represented by this great sea serpent that would sink ships and drag people to their watery graves. So basically, Thomas Hobbes argued that society exists in order to provide you with security, to keep you safe, keep you from dying, keep you from being injured grievously by the forces that exist outside of nature. A little bit thereafter, along came John Locke. Okay, John Locke argued, yes, security is important, right? But also in a state of nature, if you are outside of civilization, if you take a log of wood, cut it up, and put together a chair, okay, that chair belongs to you because you are the person that put the effort into that chair, right? And outside of a civilization, in a state of nature, somebody who is stronger, somebody who is bigger than you can come along, bop you on the head, take that chair, and claim it as their own, right? So, whereas Hobbes essentially argued that a state of nature is a situation in which it's basically a war of everybody against everybody else. John Locke wasn't necessarily um, as concerned about people necessarily going out and uh, and killing everybody, but that still you needed civilization in order to be able to protect your property, right? Hobbes thought that people were noble savages, that they're capable of loving and helping one another out, but also, let's say you find somebody with a broken leg in your territory, you'll go over, you'll help mend that broken leg, you'll nurse that person back to health. But heaven forbid that they successfully heal and they still stay in your territory and they start stealing your rocks or eating your chickens or something like that. Then you are completely warranted in a state of nature without civilization to go over and kill them, right? John Locke argues something called tabula rasa, where basically everybody's a blank slate, and it is through education primarily that you learn about right and wrong and concepts of good and evil and things like that. So there was a little bit of a distinction there. So anyway, Locke is all about security. I'm sorry, Hobbes is all about security. John Locke is all about not just security, but also property rights as well. And very famously, he stated that civilization exists to protect life, liberty, and property. Okay. And you'll learn if you do read the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson borrowed that language. He argued that chief among the rights of a state are life or of individuals living within a civilized state are life, liberty, and not property, because he didn't want to guarantee property, but the pursuit of happiness. So there's that perspective. And then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Um, the long and the short of it is that the story essentially goes that there was an individual living in a monastery. I don't know if it's based on Jean-Jacques Rousseau or not. I don't actually know much about his background history, but this is the story that is often associated with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So basically, a person living in a monastery, and they would go out to the city uh, to work and have fun and other things like that. And if they didn't make it back to the monastery by the time the curfew hour hit, the gates of the monastery were closed. And the individual, seeing the closed gates of the monastery, not having gotten back in time, knew that the next morning when the gates reopened, the the monks and the religious hierarchy that existed within the monastery would see that they did not come home the previous night, and they would be punished for not being present, essentially, in the morning. And so, after basically receiving beatings from the monks, eventually this individual got tired of it and said, hey, no longer is this monastery situation serving my best interests. And it is up to me to break away from this monastery and no longer associate with it and to find my own fortune, essentially. And this became the basis of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea of the social contract, that governments are required to meet certain requirements and guarantee the rights and the liberties of individuals living within that society and provide them with certain basic services in order for people to buy into allowing that government to basically exist. And that if the government was no longer acting in their best interest, individuals living within that society were well within their rights to revolt against the government and establish a new government, which again is the essential basis of that Declaration of Independence. So, again, we did have the Revolutionary War following the Declaration of Independence, which is a whole story unto itself. Fascinating bit of early American history. But eventually, the United States, as it later came to be known, was able to win its independence from Great Britain. Okay. Um, at its onset, the current what later became the United States acted under what is known as a confederation. So, following the termination of the Revolutionary War, the Articles of Confederation were passed in 1871, which established a league of friendship among the original 13 colonies, but did not provide a strong central government. Okay, and that here's a map of the North American continent in 1787, at which time the United States Constitution was ultimately passed. But to kind of give you a little bit of an insight, you have the 13 original colonies here. We have Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. And then surrounding it, you had territories that were under the control of the British at the time that the Revolutionary War started, that now became territories of the United States, but were not yet established as states. And then all this green territory was controlled primarily by the Spanish, and then you had some French control as well. And then, of course, Canada was primarily controlled by the British. The western part of the United States had some Russian influence in Alaska, and coming down to some of the areas that are now British Columbia in Canada, and Washington State and Oregon, what is known as the Oregon Territory, at the time was disputed by both Russia and by Spain. Now, of course, fast forward a little bit, these political boundaries and things are going to change very significantly, but this is the way things kind of looked as the Constitution was beginning to be formed. So anyway, you have these Articles of Confederation. It's a very weak union. States are printing their own money. There's nobody there to regulate interstate commerce, how to deal with any disputes between and among the states. So it became very quick in the 6 subsequent years under the Articles of Confederation that it just wasn't going to work, and that there needed to be some sort of a stronger federal government put into place. So a Congress, Continental Congress, was convened with the culmination of a number of events, right? So obviously the things that I mentioned there, states had their own constitutions, oftentimes guaranteeing different rights and different different ways of doing things from one state to the other. He had Shays' Rebellion in 1787, which threatened to potentially undermine the entire system, and again called for there to be um, a new system of government put together. Simply, like I said, because the Articles of Confederation were not serving to create a government that was going to last for any significant amount of time. And so you had the establishment of a constitutional convention, which included 55 delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, none coming from I'm sorry, they're no longer colonies, now they're states, none of which came from Rhode Island. Okay. So they were primarily young and educated men. Um, and, after a good amount of time, they produced a new written constitution with a significant commitment to liberty and natural rights. And I would like to really quickly try to give a little bit of a rundown of what the final document sort of looked like. It started with a preamble, which sort of set the tone for the rest of the document. This is something that many students in the United States do wind up memorizing. Not necessarily everyone. I certainly did while I was going through my K through 12 education. But the preamble goes, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America." So, what does that all mean? It starts with "we, the people," right? So, it establishes that the everyday individual, the citizen of the United States, was the individual that had political power. Okay. And, it says, in order to form a more perfect union, it argued that there was no such thing as perfection. There was no way to actually be perfect. So you could only strive to be more and more perfect with each subsequent iteration of whatever government or whatever it is that you're trying to do. Okay. So the first and foremost thing that it did was it established a justice system, right? Established justice there. That means courts. That means ways of dealing with both criminal and civil matters. So we're taking a little bit from Thomas Hobbes in establishing a system of recourse for criminal acts, and then a little bit from John Locke with the property rights and making sure that you could take civil action against somebody that harmed you in terms of your material possessions. And that was the first and foremost element of the aim of this Constitution. Okay. Next up, ensure domestic tranquility. Make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page, because there were conflicts, right? Like Shays' Rebellion, a lot of conflicts arising from trade disputes and stuff among the different states. So something in place to make sure that there was a general sense of peace and tranquility. So that includes things like perhaps, having a means of recourse for dealing with interstate issues, and things like that. Provide for the common defense. Okay, so one of the big things here is the establishment of the military system, and the Constitution in particular focuses on an army, and a navy, and other elements like that. But it also mentions militias. So if you take a look at the history of the Revolutionary War, you didn't necessarily have a centrally unified army that the newly formed United States had in place, but rather you had each colony, or perhaps in some cases, each of the individual cities within those colonies, again, which then became the states with the Declaration of Independence, uh, establishing their own ragtag militias for people to serve under. And the expectation was that with these various different states, these militias would persist. And there was a lot of concern that any form of government could devolve into a lesser form of government. Again, think Aristotle and how a monarchy can become a tyranny, aristocracy can become an oligarchy, or polity or a constitutional republic, like what they were trying to establish here, could devolve into a mob rule sort of democracy, which was ruled by the common people, which again Aristotle thought was the worst form of government imaginable. So anyway, so you have this like weird system and weird language being used at its onset, which again becomes a little bit contentious and problematic when we go to the first amendments to that Constitution that were passed alongside it, particularly the Second Amendment, where it talks about militias and kind of the debate that goes on there. What is a militia? The expectation was that the common citizenry at the time was supposed to keep themselves armed and well regulated, in other words, being trained in the use of those weapons in the event that these militias essentially had to be formed again to overthrow the government. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here, right? So we'll come back to that as we discuss the amendments. Promote the general welfare, right? So I guess this kind of plays in a little bit with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that there has to be the welfare of the individuals living within a civilized society being met in order for people to buy into that system and buy into the authority of the government. Again, otherwise you'll have another Declaration of Independence where people will try to break away and create a system that works better for them. Secure the blessings of liberty. So again, a lot of an emphasis on individual liberties, individual rights that the monarchy under King George was not necessarily providing to ourselves and our posterity. So not only to ourselves as the founding fathers, but to future generations, our posterity as well, the individuals that come after. Posterity, the root word there is post, which means after, so people who come after. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So these 55 founding fathers have established this Constitution for now what they would call the United States of America, as opposed to a confederacy, okay? And then you have basically 7 main articles here. And at the end of it all, you also have a Bill of Rights, which eventually became part of the amendment. But I mean, the long and the short of it, it's not a particularly long document, and I urge everybody to go ahead and read through it. Article 1 is all about the establishment of the legislature, which we're going to get into in a little bit here. Article 2 is about the executive branch, so the president and the vice president and the cabinet. And then the third main article is about the establishment of the court system, particularly the Supreme Court of the United States and the courts that are under it. And then a bunch of other specifics that deal again with some of the concepts that were established in this preamble. So we're not going to go into it in its entirety right now, but the 3 big components there that I would recommend we emphasize right now, just to kind of understand the structure of the American government itself, are those first 3 articles, which are again about the legislature, the executive, and the judicial system as well. Okay, so let's pop back here. Okay. So again, commitment to liberty and natural rights were important to that. Okay, so some of the different plans and compromises that needed to be conceded to in order to get this all to work and and put it all together, we had first and foremost the Virginia Plan, which was really the initial proposal to create a strong national government because, again, the Articles of Confederation and this loose confederacy of states was not going to last for too much longer, right? And in particular, a legislature that was elected directly by the people, which again is what we would consider to be a republic, or perhaps Aristotle would say it's a polity, based on the Greek terminology for it. Okay. And then you have the New Jersey Plan, which was a proposal to create a weak national government in contrast, with equal representation of the states. So you had these two conflicting ideas that kind of came together, I think, pretty significantly well in order to establish what was the initial United States of America. So it definitely led to the Constitution calling for a stronger national government than that of the Articles of Confederation, but still allowing the states themselves to have pretty substantial strengths, right? And I would still argue today that the 50 United States, each of which having their own constitutions, their own legislatures, their own executives, and even their own court systems, still have a pretty substantial amount of power, in large part due to Abraham Lincoln seizing more power for the presidency during the Civil War. So for like the first almost 100 years of the existence of the United States, we didn't necessarily have as strong a national government as we do today. And that, again, is partially due to the New Jersey Plan, but, still people recognize the importance of there being some degree of power established. So the compromise that came from these two plans was that you popularly elect the House based on state population. So this gave states a pretty substantial amount of power in determining what kinds of laws would ultimately pass at the federal level. But at the same time, states elected the Senate with 2 members for each state. And this Senate was sort of seen as a counterbalance to those states that had larger populations, right? States like New York, which had a very, very large population, of course, advocated for popularly elected officials based on the size of the population, right? But then the smaller states, like Rhode Island, for example, which didn't necessarily have any delegates to send, or some of the southern states that didn't necessarily have the population but were kind of the breadbasket of the United States at the time, they wanted to make sure that those states that had big populations didn't just dictate the laws that affected their states as well, right? So they're the ones that insisted that you have this state elected Senate, so that essentially there were 2 houses of the legislature existing in what we call a bicameral legislature, which is the basis of, again, what we call the Connecticut Compromise. Okay. It also established an electoral college, where it wasn't the popular vote that led to the election of the president, but rather that the states were the ones that elected the president. So even today in the United States, it's not the people that necessarily elect the president directly, but rather the people vote for the electoral college that represent the position of the state in which candidate gets votes, and that's what ultimately decides the presidency. Okay. So then the question is, what were the key issues raised during the ratification debates, and which of these are still prevalent in politics today? And I would definitely argue the states' rights versus federal question is of quintessential importance. It wasn't too long ago that the long established, about 50 years established court precedent of Roe versus Wade, which guaranteed the rights of women to obtain an abortion on the basis of medical privacy was overturned. And so at the federal level, no longer was there this mandate that medical privacy is of quintessential importance. And instead, now each of the 50 states had to determine their own policies on abortion rights, right? So that's something that's definitely still around. Go ahead and think of others that might be present as well. Okay, so what happened? The Constitution established a republic, right? A representative democracy with judicial review, and key and central to those ideas are federalism, meaning that you do have this strong national government in place that overarches above the 50 different states. Well, at the time, the 13 different states. And that each of those 13 states, which later would balloon up to 50 states, would all have powers of their own as well. Okay, and there was this big emphasis on separation of powers. There were enumerated powers, those specifically granted to the federal government. There were reserve powers, those that were specifically reserved for the states to decide upon. And then there were concurrent powers, where states had some degree of power, the federal government had some degree of power to determine what would ultimately happen, but ultimately you had this idea of federal supremacy. Okay, so this all came about in large part to the Connecticut Compromise, which again, chief among its determinations was that you had to have a bicameral legislation. So that comes from Latin, bicameral, so bi meaning two, and camera meaning spaces or houses, or in the case of the United States Congress, two chambers. Camera, chamber, are the same basic root word. But basically, you had the Senate, which had basically equal representation among all 50 states, and the House of Representatives, which was based on population. So if the population-based House of Representatives passed some sort of a law, and the smaller states didn't like that, in the Senate, they could refuse to pass that piece of legislation and or potentially change it substantially, so that it would go back to the House of Representatives for approval before. It was a whole big system of allowing for there to be a lot of legislative compromise. And where does this all come from, right? Oh, these founding fathers, they were these geniuses that came up with these ideas. I mean, yes, to some extent, they were geniuses. I would definitely argue that they were among some of the greatest thinkers in the United States at the time. But there was some degree of prior history that influenced this. So if you'll notice the class, I've uploaded a number of different documents here. There is a document written by Aristotle that commented on the Athenian constitution. And then I have an abridged version because it's a little bit of a difficult read, right? It was basically the musings of Aristotle. And it almost seems like there's no rhyme and reason, so I provided a little bit of context to it by kind of abridging what was going on there. And then there's a nice little basic breakdown of the way that the Athenian government looked. So you had the citizenry, the demos, the common people, who were, anybody that was over the age of 20 and male. Then you had the assembly. There was more of a direct democracy under the Greek system. You needed at least 6,000 people to show up in order to have laws and policies basically passed. And it was all done by majority, by a show of hands. So if you had 6,000 people able to show up, you were able to pass laws based on a popular vote. Okay. From that assembly, there was the Court of 6,000, which was appointed by lot with a secret majority vote. You had the Court of Areopagus, which consisted of all of the ex-archons, which are on this side. We'll talk about that here. The 9 archons and other magistrates were appointed by lot. You had 10 generals that were elected from the citizenry, and then you had other officers that were elected from this assembly, okay? And then here in the middle, you had a council of 500, which again was appointed by lot, that established the head of state for the day, which again was chosen by lot, and the presiding 50. So these were the individuals that were the head of state was the chief executive, and then you had 50 other individuals that were ultimately responsible for determining what would get on the docket for that day in terms of political decision making. Okay, so this is, I think, the prototypic basis, if you will, of the United States legislature, essentially. And perhaps a little bit of an influence on the executive as well. Okay. And then we also have the Constitution of the Roman Republic abridged here, which you'll, if you go ahead and look at it, I think in many ways really echoes and shadows the United States Constitution to a pretty significant degree, where some of the key elements of the Roman Republic were the establishment of a Senate. Hey, look at that. We have a Senate too in the United States Constitution. Magistrates were the individuals with executive and judicial powers. In the United States, we decided, hey, we're going to split those up. We're going to have a separate executive branch. We're going to have a separate judicial branch. And then a bunch of assemblies. And basically these assemblies were the ones that were responsible for making a lot of the decisions. Again, based on the representation from individuals, again chosen to be into that elected position. Okay, so basically, again looking at these two forms of government, let's start with the Greek. You had the assembly, known as the ecclesia, where all eligible citizens were able to directly vote on laws, issues of war, and things like that. And then you had the Council of 500 that we mentioned there, or the Boule, which was sort of the executive body. Okay, so that kind of influenced the U.S. Constitution, where we have a legislature and executive. The Roman Republic, on the other hand, in particular, had the establishment of what could be argued is a bicameral legislation, like what the Connecticut Compromise ultimately led us to. So the Senate, those were individuals who were not directly elected by the citizenry. So these were the individuals that advised the magistrates, they controlled the finances, they provide guidance on foreign policy and things like that. So they were kind of like with the Parliament in Great Britain and the United Kingdom, with the establishment of the Magna Carta. It established the House of Lords, which is essentially like the Roman Republic's Senate. So again, you don't have to look. You don't have to think that the American founding fathers, the U.S. founding fathers, were without precedent in establishing these sorts of things. We did have the Roman Republic, and then subsequently Great Britain with the Magna Carta that established again a bicameral legislative system. Anyway, the other side of the coin, because again it's a bicameral two-chamber system, you had these popular assemblies that were also they were the individuals who ultimately elected the magistrates, and they were the ones who had the executive power to pass the laws. So that was further broken down into two committees, the Comitia Centuriata, and you had the Comitia Tributa. And these were the individuals that established what the executive branch would basically look like of the Roman Republic, and were the ones that actually passed the laws that were debated among the individuals in those assemblies. Okay, so very, very inspirational to the system that was ultimately established in the United States. Okay, So again, some of the ideas and the philosophies that led to the establishment of the United States system, and of course the Constitution that provided the framework for that system. The idea that Republican government was capable of ruling even in the absence of political virtue, right? The idea that if you had an underlying structure that could not be easily altered, and the guarantee of certain powers to different chambers and different elements of the government. Um, you were able to create a system where even if people were corrupt, even if people didn't have the interests of the people at heart, there was somebody there to tell them no, basically, which established what was uh, later referred to as checks and balances. Okay, so the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary all have their own powers to basically tell the other elements of the government no, right? So the legislature creates the laws, which it then has to send to the executive, to the president of the United States and the cabinet. The president approves or can what is known as veto the decision that was made by the legislature, basically send it back to them. Um, and it gets to ultimately decide how the policy, which is the rules and the underlying um, laws and whatnot that were established by the legislature, how those get put into practice with programs. The executive, the president, has its cabinet, which consists of a number of different departments, under which there is a federal bureaucracy, which changed a little bit over time. You now have a more consistent system in place where um, you don't basically reconstruct your bureaucracy with every new presidency. But the long and the short of it there is that the executive gets to decide how the law passed in the legislature by the Senate and the House ultimately get put into effect. Okay, and then the judiciary has the power of what's known as judicial review, which it essentially granted itself from Marbury versus Madison, a great political decision that established that the Supreme Court had that power. Now, they didn't just pull this out of the air. This was, something that was debated among the founding fathers pretty substantially and significantly. But basically, they determined, yeah, we do have the power to say, legislature, you just passed something that violates the Constitution. Executive branch, you're doing something that is violating the Constitution. So each of these different um, elements of the government, these there's internal multiple chambers in the legislature to make sure that nobody has too much power. The executive can check the legislature. The judiciary can check both the legislature and the presidency. Everybody's there and putting everybody into a balance of power to ensure that there are there's nobody taking too much control at any given time. Okay. And of course, there were different political factions that came about uh, that argued for different elements and different emphases in the government. You had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists that were some of the first factions to kind of arise. The Federalists argued more for the establishment of a strong federal government. The Anti-Federalists wanted more of an emphasis on the power of the individual states, essentially, give or take. I'm really paraphrasing that. Go ahead and read the Federalist Papers and the arguments against it as well. But here's sort of a breakdown. The Federalists were nationalists, right? They wanted a strong central national government, strong identity of the United States as its own thing. And they viewed liberty as protected by the large republic, right? And that the government existed to protect the liberties of individuals, right? And so they established a number of coalitions, a lot of which were rather politically moderate. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, they were more about states' rights. They were more about things should be a little bit more like the Articles of Confederation, just making sure that the problems that existed in the Articles of Confederation don't persist, right? So they wanted a small republic or confederation, and they wanted to limit the central powers. They didn't want a strong monarchy like what came about um, in Great Britain with King George, right? They wanted to absolutely limit the central powers. You know, the Constitution isn't the only way things could have played out. Some individuals advocated making George Washington the king of the United States, or to establish a dual monarchy system, like what existed in some of the Central European countries historically. Um, but the Anti-Federalists also insisted on the establishment of a Bill of Rights that no, the republic shouldn't be the one guaranteeing these liberties. These are natural rights that everybody has, right? They are granted naturally. They exist in a state of nature, whether given by God or otherwise, right? So we just need to establish that these are laws, these are rights that we possess that nobody can take away. And it's not just that the government says that it's okay, but we have these rights no matter what, and nobody can try to take it away from us. Otherwise, the judiciary or the legislature or the executive should shut that stuff down immediately, right? So liberties are guaranteed by the Constitution before the Bill of Rights was added, including things like the writ of habeas corpus, no bills of attainder, no ex post facto laws, the right to trial by jury. Citizens of each state are entitled to the same privileges and immunities, and there are no religious qualifications for office. So these are already some liberty-based things. You know, you have to prove a crime was committed. You know, you can't be charged for a crime if there was no criminal law on the books beforehand that established it as a crime. You know, the right to have a trial by a jury of your peers rather than some, you know, elitist, um, uh, you know, judiciary making all the decisions, and basically some of the rights that were echoed in the First Amendment of the Constitution, which is that there are no religious qualifications for any sort of office to be held. Okay, so again, it was the Anti-Federalists that absolutely insisted that we needed a Bill of Rights. Okay, so the Bill of Rights was ultimately put in, and with it, the first 10 amendments were ultimately passed, which I'll get into in a little bit. Um, there was also another big topic of debate, a big blemish, even one that even slave owner and the initial author of the United States Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, knew would come back to bite them in the behind, essentially, right? Thomas Jefferson very famously argued that slavery was going to be that one thing that was going to be just a big problem in the United States for many, many years to come, essentially, right? So, in order for the Constitution to be ratified, they needed the Southern states. The founding fathers needed the Southern states to ratify as well. What were the Southern states known for? They had slavery, right? Very large swaths of agricultural land and the use of slave labor to attend to those fields and things like that. The North had some degree of slavery, but it was far less common, far less popular. And, you know, with the passage of time, it was virtually, you know, a very big distinction between the North and the South really became prominent, where the North essentially rejected slavery for a pretty large chunk of the history of the United States, but the Southern states, you know, held on to it, right? It was basically the entire basis of the economy, right? And so, how do you deal with the population of slaves? The compromise that was reached under the United States Constitution was known as the Greatest Compromise, or the Three-Fifths Compromise, where every slave was treated as 3/5 of a person, right? It made sure that the southern states didn't gain too much power from having the large population of slaves and, you know, potentially acquiring more slaves to make it even more powerful politically. But it also ensured that the southern states, didn't completely lack power, right? The population of the southern states was very much smaller than most of the northern states, um, because again, you had substantially larger agricultural territory rather than condensed cities. Okay, so here is a breakdown of the ratification of the Constitution by state. So initial ratification, we have the darker orange, were states that were very strongly in favor of the Constitution and ratified it early. The yellow states were the states that also ratified it initially, but it took a lot of convincing, basically. And then the blue states, Rhode Island and North Carolina, again, Rhode Island didn't have any representatives, initially opposed the establishment of the Constitution, but did wind up ultimately ratifying it as well, right? So Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Georgia, very eager to have this Constitution. South Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. Well, you got to talk this stuff out before we approve it. And then Rhode Island and North Carolina were like, I don't know if this is going to work. North Carolina, definitely a little bit concerned about slavery. And then Rhode Island, hey, we didn't have any representatives. Why would I approve this, right? Don't worry, we got you, Rhode Island, buddy. But eventually they were ultimately be able to be convinced. Okay. So then let's talk about those 10 amendments to the Constitution. So you did have the initial ratification of the United States Constitution, but along with it came amendments, right? And how you can amend the Constitution is written about in the Constitution. Imagine that, right? So an amendment can be proposed in two ways, right? Either a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress, meaning that both the Senate and the House of Representatives, the popular representation portion of the legislature, and the more elite two per state part of the legislature, and then a vote at a national constitutional convention called by Congress at the request of 2/3 of the state legislatures. So if you can get 2/3 of the states to say, hey, we need a constitutional convention to change things, that's the other way that you can potentially amend the Constitution. And so an amendment can be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. So it's not even half. You need to have 75% of the state legislatures approve any changes to the Constitution, or 3/4 of the state at any of these special conventions. So if, again, you had 2/3 of the state legislatures agree to meet, you still need 75% of the states to agree at the end, right? So the most typical way of doing it is a vote by both houses of Congress with passage of the amendment by 3/4 of the state legislatures. That was used for all but one of the amendments at this point. The other option for the 21st Amendment, a vote of 2/3 by both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states approved the passage of the 21st Amendment at a special convention. But there's never been a national constitutional convention as yet to change the Constitution. It'll be interesting to see if that is ever used within our lifetimes or at some point in the distant future. It'll be really interesting to see. Who knows how much society will have to change that, the state legislatures will have to be like, hey, wait a minute, we need to change things up to the basic law of the land, which hasn't changed too fundamentally in about 200, almost 50 years now. Okay, so some of the post-ratification debates, right? And this is something to ask yourselves as well. So, do you believe that the American government does too much or too little for its citizens, and why? And I want you to defend your answers, right? And if you can, maybe post in the comments or something like that, I would very much appreciate that. But some of the big topics here of discussion that continue to pervade economic interests first and foremost, right? And state interests generally dominate that discussion. We began with the slavery debate that was ended by the Civil War. Um, but even today, how do you run the economy of the United States and for each of the now 50 states that exist within the Union? Right? And there are certain states that tend to have more of a welfare focused system where there are high taxes, but also a lot of government programs. And then other states that try to limit the amount of taxes that are collected, but allow people to essentially keep more of their money, but have fewer government services available to them. And then, of course, at the federal level, how much should that be impacted as well, right? And that's kind of the big economic debate between the more conservative or what we would actually call economically liberal perspective, or the more liberal progressive perspective, where you want to have more of a big government influence and more welfare services and things like that. Okay. Then, of course, constitution and equality is the other big thing, right? Whenever you talk about the political spectrum, you talk about how people are economically, and then you talk about how they are socially, right? So the framers of the Constitution didn't necessarily view liberty and political equality as being in conflict, but certainly those ideas did start to come about as things were moved on. And they saw political privilege as the worst type of political inequality, right? Chief among some of the zingers that some of the founding fathers had was the idea that you know people should basically serve in government and then get out so that they don't get corrupted, basically, by the power that exists within it. So there is a little bit of a concern, again, with political equality and liberty, and socially, what does it mean to have political equality, and what does it mean to have individual liberty? If you don't have equal amounts of liberty, if you don't have political equality, what does that mean for things? So, you have the debates, that ultimately led to the establishment of the various feminisms under critical theory, which were the basis for women essentially gaining the right to vote, and being allowed to participate in the workplace and in politics and things like that. It was ultimately responsible for the 1965 Civil Rights Act and then subsequent iterations thereof that allowed individuals of all sorts of different protected classes, giving them the right to political participation and the right to be free from discrimination and things like that. So these are things that didn't necessarily initially pop up, that later became very important. Okay, which brings us to today, right? What are some of the big topics of discussion and debates that are still ongoing about the United States government? Well, one is reducing the separation of powers, increasing the authority of the president, and lengthening terms for members of the House. So the members of the House of Representatives serve for 2 years, right? So this is the population-based chamber of the bicameral legislature, that is the Congress. They currently serve for 2 years, and the expectation was people would get in and get out. based on population. The Senate, on the other hand, serves for 6 years, right? They were supposed to be there for the long term. They were supposed to make long term decisions, right? And then, of course, increasing presidential authority has been something that has come back, and the pendulum has kind of swung on that in multiple directions. Abraham Lincoln um, established a lot of presidential authority with the Civil War, giving himself essentially powers that did not exist before. Franklin Roosevelt during World War II engaged in essentially a political power grab as well, to a pretty significant degree, so much so that there are so many different court cases by the Supreme Court essentially telling Roosevelt, no, you can't do that. It's unconstitutional, time and time again. Um, and then more recently, you've seen a lot of individuals try to um, exercise more political authority as president by passing executive decisions and things like that. To some degree, under George Bush, the second, there was that initial debate coming through. Continued with debates on things that Barack Obama did, and then subsequently with Donald Trump, who again also tried to increase presidential authority as well. So there's a big question as to where that's going to go, and if checks and balances are going to ultimately stop the president from gaining additional authority in the future. Okay, making the system less democratic, right, is another thing that is being discussed. A balanced budget amendment, right? Don't allow the legislature and the executive to establish their own budget that borrows too much and puts everybody in debt, right? The national debt here in the United States is constantly changing and increasing pretty substantially. Let's see where it stands as of right now. It's 5:15 p.m. on, I believe it's January 16th today. Let's see. National debt today is currently at, one second, it's loading up. It should be about 36 trillion right now, but let's see exactly what that is. We have it at 36 trillion 359 billion 996 million. We're just passing $900,000 in debt, and that is growing by the millions, very, very rapidly, by about $1 million every couple of seconds here. So yeah, should we limit democracy in order to make sure that we don't spend too much money? Also, the notion of a line item veto. Should the president be able to take out parts of a bill passed by the legislature and approve parts of it, but not the entirety? The way it is right now, the president approves all of it or none of it, right? So is that something that should be allowed? Or should the president be able to have more authority to take out those specific bits that he or she doesn't agree with? And again, eliminating some of the democratic elements of that. And do we narrow the authority of the federal courts, right? Especially with the elimination of precedent with Roe versus Wade. Big discussion about how much power the federal court should have for things like judicial review and things like that. Then the question is, who is right? How do we come to that determination? Well, we study the government's historical evolution. We see what has happened in the past, what has worked, what hasn't worked, what has led to contention and potential problems, and what isn't necessarily the worst decision for us to potentially make with regard to the government. We should study how the government works and why it has produced the policies that we see. And we might want to study the practices of some other nations. So bringing in maybe some comparative politics to understand our own perspectives and our own philosophies, and the social dynamics and the political philosophies and the political systems that we ultimately base most of our decisions on, which is going to be, again, the basis of a lot of the discussions that we're going to have in um, future weeks as we move along here. So thank you so much for bearing with me and my illness. Hopefully, my voice will be 100% when I come back to the classroom on Wednesday. But until then, have a fantastic week. And like I said, do take some time to study some of the different constitutions throughout history, and in particular, emphasize the United States Constitution. It'll really help a lot of people, especially individuals who might not necessarily be as familiar with the American political system. Exactly how things are set up, and why we do things the way that we do will hopefully make a little bit more sense if you see how things are actually carried out um, in executing that that Constitution. All right, have a good one. Bye bye.